So first begin by assuming meditation posture, making sure that we're sitting comfortably with our back straight, hands folded in the lap, right hand on the left palm with the thumb tips touching. Arms extended out slightly from the body, with our head slightly tilted forward, eyes half open and half closed. And having set the physical posture, we set the mental posture or motivation for our practice. Recognizing that my mind is a continuum. Today's mind is a continuum of yesterday's mind. Tomorrow's mind is a continuation of today's mind. And so the quality of my mind, my motivation at any one time, will influence the later moments. We can produce any future result in our mental continuum that we would like, simply by setting the seed. What's the most positive conceivable result we could achieve from our meditation practice? What would be the most beneficial, positive future point of mind in our own mental continuum we would like to experience? How wonderful if we were able to completely eliminate all of our negative minds, all our self-cherishing minds, all our confusion, all our agitation. How wonderful if our mind could be a state qualified by continuous love and compassion, extended to every living being, whatever our history with them, whatever they do or say. We would hold them in our heart as fondly and warmly as our own dear mother or father, our own dear child, brother or sister. How wonderful if at a future point in this very mental continuum we have complete clarity what to do to benefit every other living being. We have limitless energy to achieve that, limitless wisdom, limitless insight. These are the qualities of enlightenment. And by setting the aspiration that all of our positive actions, including this time we spend in meditation, are causes for that result, we will ultimately realize it, experience it directly within our own mental continuum. How much benefit then can we bring to every other living being without exception? And so we can reflect like that for a short time. Then we can engage in extraordinary relaxation practice with the rainbow body meditation. Visualizing that at our crown chakra, at the very top of our head, is a brilliant rainbow-coloured drop of light. Light rays emanate from this drop, transforming our crown chakra into the nature of rainbow light. This brilliant rainbow-coloured drop of light then descends to our throat chakra, also transforming it into rainbow light. The rainbow-coloured drop next descends to our heart chakra, also transforming it into rainbow light. It then descends to our navel chakra, also transforming it into rainbow-coloured light. Finally, the drop descends to the chakra at the base of our spine, transforming it into rainbow-coloured light. Hold the appearance of each of these chakras: crown, throat, heart, navel, and base of the spine. as in the nature of rainbow light. Rainbow light then emanates from each of these 5 chakras, pervading our body and transforming our coarse body into a body composed of rainbow light. Stabilize single-pointedly on this sense of our body transformed into radiant, peaceful, rainbow-coloured light. The rainbow light then emanates outwards from our body into our immediate surroundings. So this temple or your house or room, instantly transforming it into the nature of rainbow light. This beautiful, peaceful, powerful rainbow light continues to emanate and spread, transforming the land and region around you into the nature of rainbow light. Feel this city, this state, this continent is transformed into rainbow light, and all living beings within this continent the rainbow light extends further, transforming the whole of this planet Earth, all environments, all living beings, into rainbow forms. and feel that it extends still further to the farthest limits of space, encompassing all universes, all realms, all environments, and all living beings. So that all existence without exception are in the nature of rainbow light. And we stabilize on this for a time. Then visualize that this rainbow light encompassing all universes, all beings, withdraws and collects back, dissolving step by step into our own rainbow light natured body. All the rainbow light dissolves back into us. Our rainbow light nature body then begins to collect and dissolve from the feet upwards, progressively to our navel, heart, throat, until all rainbow light collects and dissolves into a single rainbow-coloured drop of light at our crown. Very clear, very radiant. This rainbow drop of light becomes smaller and smaller, collecting and dissolving into emptiness. And thinking through this meditation, I myself, every living being without exception, have joy, bliss, fantastic good conditions, freedom from all problems, sickness, negativities, and so forth. May this be a cause in my own mental continuum that for the sake of others, quickly, easily, effortlessly achieve enlightenment, Buddhahood simultaneously. And we can release our attention and conclude the meditation. So we've had a few weeks break, and we're going to have another few weeks break after this. But where were we up to? So we're going through part 4 of Path to Enlightenment, where Geshe explains the teachings of the medium scope. And the essential subject of the medium scope is the teachings of the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths briefly explain first the first truth, true sufferings, why it is that our experience of psychic existence will always ultimately be unsatisfactory. Secondly, the second noble truth, true cause, why this is the case. Why is it that although we continuously search for happiness, that really defines our lives, our existence, the continuous search for more and more happiness to minimize any sort of unsatisfactory experience, why we can never fully and reliably pull that off. And according to the second noble truth or true cause, the reason is because we hold the causes of psychic existence within us. And in particular, we have delusion and karma. And of those two, delusion is the more fundamental because, as we saw last time, it's delusion that produces the cycle of karma. The third truth, because we can understand the cause, then we can see that in principle, if we were to remove the cause of delusion, and in particular remove the root delusion of the ignorance that grasps at the inherent existence of self and other, then everything else, then all the rest of psychic existence falls in a heap. So that in principle, it's possible to bring about a cessation to this cycle of unsatisfactory experiences of cause and effect. And fourthly, the true path is that the actual method to do that, to get from where we are now to the cessation of suffering, is by generating the pathway minds, the various realizations that we generate as a result of practicing the path to enlightenment that ultimately are the opponent to the ignorance that grasps at inherent existence. So we've gone through the first noble truth. We're still going through the second, which Geshe gives a detailed explanation of in chapters 14 and 15 of Path to Enlightenment. And as we've seen before, the way Geshe tackles this or structures this subject with the outline on page 415 is firstly by talking about delusions, how it is, what they are, how it is that they arise, which we've gone through in a lot of detail. Secondly, also in chapter 14, how it is that karma is created based on delusions, also explained in chapter 14, which we finished up with last time. And thirdly, the way we die and are conceived, which explains the way that this cycle of delusion and karma extends not only within our current life, but also to our future existences. And so we started talking about this in the last session, and we'll continue with it today. So again, as we said last time in talking about this subject of death and rebirth generally, if we are back in the small scope teachings, Geshe also goes into some detail talking about death and impermanence. So particularly by practicing the small scope, we generate the understanding that our death is absolutely certain. There's nothing else we can much bank on in life. We can absolutely bank on the fact that our life will come to an end. When that is going to happen, the time of death, completely uncertain. Absolutely no way of knowing. We also know that, or the teachings give us an indication of what's going to be useful to us at the time of death. So here in the medium scope, we expand upon that perspective and in particular go into the details of how it is that the death process occurs. And again, as with everything in Path to Enlightenment, the focus is very practical, not simply academic or dispensing information. The reason for explaining the death process here in such detail is that so that we individually understand it, that we can prepare for it, so that when we each individually go through this process, we're able to, well, we have some context. We are able to anticipate what's going to happen. And just by doing that, that dispels a lot of the fear and uncertainty that we might otherwise have. Our mind is more stable and less disoriented by what we're going through at the time. Geshe explains that advanced Vajrayana practitioners are able to bring the whole death process into their path. And actually, if we're a really skilled meditator, then the time of death can actually be an opportunity to develop extraordinary realizations. But even for those practitioners who can do that, the only way that they're able to do that is by first gaining an expert understanding of the death process so that they're prepared for it. So Geshe considers this subject in 5 parts, and there's a summary at the top of page 440. And these are the circumstances of death, the mind at death, from where the heat of the body dissolves, how you enter the intermediate state, and how you take rebirth. Last time we ran through Geshe's explanation of the circumstances of death, and this is basically about the broad factors that bring about the end of this life. So it will be one or more of the exhaustion of the throwing karma that established this life, the exhaustion of our merit, or the loss of power of our life force. And Geshe says that if all three of those come together, then definitely we will die at that point in time. If only one of them is present and the other two aren't, then we won't necessarily die. And when that's the case, it's possible in principle to extend our lifespan through things such as accumulating merit, long life meditation practices, and so forth and so forth. But however well we do that, however well we're able to extend our life, we can't do it indefinitely. There will ultimately come a point where we leave our current existence. And the most important thing when we get to that point is our state of mind at the time of death. And that's because the state of mind at the time of death has a huge influence on our next rebirth state. So in this section, the mind at death, there isn't a formal outline, but basically Geshe teaches this under 5 headings. So he talks about death with a virtuous mind, a non-virtuous mind, or a neutral mind, and then he goes to an explanation in detail of the actual death process. And he does that under the next 2 headings, which talk about the 25 gross objects, which we'll come to, and the dissolution of those 25 gross objects. Again, before we leap into this, it's useful to understand sort of how it works at a big picture level. So essentially, as we go through the process of death, and we can talk about it in terms of the 5 stages that we'll explain, and the 5 stages has a further, the 5th has 4 subdivisions, so it's like 8 stages altogether. As we go through those, progressively our gross levels of consciousness dissolve. So we can think about our mind in terms of grosser and subtle levels of consciousness. So our normal waking level of consciousness, what we're experiencing now, is a grosser level of consciousness. When we are in the dream state, for example, that's an example of a subtler level of consciousness, because everything we experience at that time is generated by mind. There are even subtler levels of consciousness, and even by way of an ordinary example, if we're in a deep, deep sleep and not dreaming, nonetheless we have a very subtle level of consciousness that's still occurring. Because if that weren't the case, it wouldn't be possible to wake up a sleeping person by shaking them or by setting off an alarm or something like that. It's because there's this very subtle level of consciousness that's going on that it's possible to wake from a deep sleep. So effectively what's happening through the death process is that the grosser levels of consciousness are withdrawing and subsiding into successively more subtle levels of consciousness. And it's the last gross level of consciousness that is the main determinant of our next rebirth state, whether that last gross moment of consciousness is virtuous, non-virtuous, or neutral. Again, before we jump into this, it's good to reflect on, honestly, our own take on death, how we feel about the process of death individually. What's our perspective on it? For most of us, it wouldn't be at all uncommon for us not to want to think about it, to try to push it away. Even when we're practicing path to enlightenment, often we might feel that we'd like to spend most of our time on uplifting, inspirational subjects, such as great compassion, great love, bodhicitta, or intriguing subjects like emptiness. So this natural wish that we have, not particularly to reflect on death, isn't all that surprising. But recognizing that, we can face into that. We can reflect on why it is that we might have some aversion or reluctance to contemplate something that is, after all, completely inevitable. We know it's completely inevitable. Most of our life, we kind of feel that what's going to happen to us in the future is pretty much predictable within certain parameters. So actually, our future life is a lot less predictable than we really think, because we tend to impose a lot more permanence on things than is actually the case. But generally, we kind of think, well, I have a fair idea of what my life is going to be like next week, next month, or next year. I can think that through, and I have a fair sense of what I'm going to be doing and thinking and experiencing. When we die, what happens? What's it going to be like? Unless we are clairvoyant, we have no way of knowing. So this uncertainty that we feel is genuine. So it has a rational, factual basis. So we don't even know whether anything will happen after death. We don't actually know from our own direct experience. Of course, we can take guidance from trusted sources, and in fact, most of our life we actually are acting on guidance from trusted sources anyway, but we have no way from the point of view of our own experience of knowing the day after, the 24 hours after our death, what we will be experiencing. Will what we be experiencing be something that's enjoyable, pleasant? Will it be something that is difficult? After our death, what sort of environment will we find ourselves in? Who will we be? What sort of person will we be? Will we be male or female? Will we be human? Who will we be? Who will we be with? Who will be our family? Who will be our community, and so forth? So nothing in this life itself carries that level of uncertainty that does the experience of facing into death. So it's natural to have some apprehension of that and to face into that, not to avoid it. The point of these teachings, though, is to familiarize ourselves with that idea, to familiarize ourselves with the process of death, with the fact of death, so that before we experience it ourselves, we've built a mental framework about it. Perhaps ideally, we've even gone through the preparatory practices that are described in the Path to Enlightenment. So we do a dry run, if you like, of our own experience of death. So we're actually quite familiar with it when the death process happens as well. And we won't get to that today, but that section at the end of this chapter, which Nick will take you through after the retreat, what to do at the time of death, wonderful practical advice. And not only because of the instructions for what to do when we are individually going through death ourselves, but also how we prepare for it within this life. There's a great explanation of the practice of the five forces here, and further in chapter 19, which is the practice of how to practice bodhicitta. There's an explanation of how we practice those five forces in this life, how day by day, using these five forces, we're creating the framework so that we can die well. If we develop that understanding, then we would realize that death in itself is not something to be feared. What death is simply the dissolution of these grosser levels of consciousness, the disengagement of this current sense of I that we have, that's currently associated with our aggregates, with our body, with our experience, the thing that we identify the I with, the disengagement of that with its current aggregates. Ultimately, that's all that death is. From a Buddhist point of view, we've done this death thing literally countless times before, and until we attain liberation, we will do this death thing countless times again. In itself, that process of disengagement with our current aggregates, it's neither fearful or delightful, it's neither pleasant nor unpleasant, any more than the process of falling asleep, which is also another example of our consciousness progressively, gross levels of consciousness dissolving into more subtle levels of consciousness. But the point is that death is a huge inflection point in shaping our future experience. So most of the decisions that we make in life day to day aren't all that consequential. They aren't obviously life-changing. So there might be a few points in this life that really are hugely life-changing. So we decide to take this job or that job. That's going to have a big influence on what we're going to be doing with our time and what's going to be happening in our mind over the time we hold that job. Do I enter this relationship or not? Again, another huge influence on what we will be doing, what we will be experiencing. Should I have kids or not? Again, all of these are the sort of life decisions that do have a huge influence. A lot of people, myself included, have experiences like coming into a Dharma centre for the first time, and that decision to actually come to a Dharma centre, huge influence on what's happening with our experience later on. So there are some times in our life that are like that. The time of death is the big daddy or the big parent of them all in terms of its influence on our future experience, because it's the predominant influence on what the quality of our next life will be like. And that will influence what we'll be doing for the duration of that next life. So potentially for decades and decades, or in some cases, even for longer than that. But what actually shapes that future life, it isn't death, it isn't simply the process of our consciousness dissolving, it's the state of our mind at the time of death. If we really understood it properly, so if we're really doing a rational analysis, and we're really clear about it, we wouldn't really fear death so much. What we would fear is our own delusions and our own negative minds. We would fear the potential that they would have to shape the quality of our next life, for our anger or our resentment or our jealousy or our grasping to be the thing that is influencing our mind at the time of death. And we wouldn't fear that in a helpless, paralyzed sort of way, because remember what Shantideva said, delusions have no arms, no legs. We don't need to do what they say, but we would definitely see them for what they are. We would see delusions for where they can lead us. It's a bit like driving defensively in heavy traffic. So we're not so immobilized by the fear of traffic that we never get in our car and drive, but we're careful about it. So we're mindful of the risks and we do everything that we can to avoid it. It's like that with delusions. We all have delusions. They're as inevitable as the experience of other cars in heavy traffic, but we should be mindful of where they can lead us. And fearing our delusions in this way, day by day, during our life, is actually much more sensible than fearing death. Actually, you could say that if we adopt that mind stream, recognize our delusions, do our best, we won't always succeed, do our best not to do what they want, to minimize them, on the other hand, to cultivate our positive minds, cultivate our positive actions, that's actually the best preparation, you could say, for the time of death. Because if we cultivate this habit, that means avoiding delusions, that means it's less likely that they will come up at the time of death or that they will be strong and influence us. The more we cultivate the habit of developing positive minds, the more they are likely to be the dominant factor at the time of our death. So Geshe talks about these three possibilities, starting at page 442. So the first is death with a virtuous mind. So this refers to the fact where the last conceptual mind that we have, the last gross conceptual mind that we have, is a virtuous state of mind. And that could be the case because we do have this practice of cultivating our positive minds as much as we can during this life. Also, in the moment of the time of death, it can be because we're surrounded by people who are encouraging us to develop positive minds. It could be inspired by a recollection of our teacher, by a recollection of the teachings of the Buddha. Of course, we're not just talking about Buddhists. It could be for a person who's not of a Buddhist faith. It could be a recollection of any spiritual teacher or teaching that they find positive or inspiring. And if that's the last gross conceptual mind that we have before the gross minds absorb into the subtle minds, well then that's the thing that will colour our next experience. If we have, if that's the way that we die, then it's said that we die very peacefully. The experience is pleasant. We have a light-filled vision, and basically we can leave this life, and we've maximised our chances that our next life will similarly be coloured by positivity and by an environment and a setting that reflects that. We can die with a virtuous mind. So the last gross conceptual mind that comes up could be a mind of anger. So if we have a strong habit of resentment, of reflecting on the wrongs that we feel have been done to us, well, then it's more likely that that's going to be the mental pattern that repeats itself at the time of death. And if that's the case, or Geshe said, if somebody were to stimulate those thoughts at the time of death by um, referring to wrongs that have been done to us, well, then that's what will condition our future experience. We will maintain that state of mind as the gross minds dissolve into the subtle minds, and because delusions are by their nature unpeaceful, that's their definition. It means that our experience will be agitated. We won't die peacefully. We may have an experience of fear. If we die with a neutral mind, so that the final gross thoughts are neither particularly virtuous or non-virtuous, well then the experience of death has neither an experience of strong pleasure nor of suffering, but what happens next depends on our overall balance of positive and negative minds to that point within our mental continuum. So Geshe makes the point then if we're with somebody who is dying, that the best thing we can do is to try and help them die with a peaceful, happy state of mind. Do what we can to help them to generate peaceful and positive states of mind. Geshe says that in the case of an ordinary person who's dying and we think that they would fear death, we might know that they're dying and they don't, that it's better not to engage with that subject at all. So sometimes we might feel, well, look, it's better to be upfront and honest with people. You should really tell them like it is. Buddhist point of view, well, yeah, maybe, sometimes not really. So if it's somebody who has a strong mind, they're not going to be affected by that. And if I had time, I could give you lots of examples of Geshe giving unbelievably direct instructions about death to people, not mincing words, not needing to cater to their senses, to their sensitivities. If somebody's in that case, we can be completely upfront about it. But because the main thing that's important to do is to make sure that the person doesn't have fear, that they're peaceful, that they're relaxed. If that's not the case, well then we don't have to talk about the process of death directly. The main thing is to make them relaxed and as positive as possible. So the actual death process I mentioned before, you can talk about it in 5 stages, the last of which has 4 parts. So you can also talk about it as 8 levels of experience. And these are really a description of the progressive dissolution of these grosser states of mind and experience. And as each one of them dissolves, the emergence of the more subtle levels of experience. And in order to explain these 8 levels, then Geshe gives an explanation of what are called 25 gross objects, because these 25 gross objects, which are various states of mind and so forth, that we'll go through quickly, it's each of these that progressively change as we go through these eight stages. So Geshe gives a listing of them on pages 442, 444 and 445 of Path to Enlightenment, and he presents them in 5 groups. I'll just go through them quickly. So the first lot of 5 are the 5 aggregates that we already know about. The second lot of 5 are what are called the 5 basic wisdoms. We'll go through a bit of an explanation of those. The next 4 are the 4 great elements. So these are earth, water, fire, and wind. And what these are really talking about, so it's not simply like some medieval system of alchemy or something like that. What we're really talking about are various attributes of the body. So earth element, we're referring to the solid aspects of the body. The water element, we're talking about the liquid or fluid elements of the body. Fire, the heat of the body. Wind, the energies, the various energies, gross and subtle of the body that we'll come back to in a moment. 6 sources, which are effectively the basis of our 6 consciousnesses, the 5 sense consciousnesses and the mental consciousness, and the 5 objects, which are the objects of the sense consciousness. So shape and colour in the case of the eye sense power, sounds in the case of the ear sense power, and so forth. So Geshe then goes into a bit of an explanation of the 2 of these that are a little bit less familiar. So one of those groups is the 5 basic wisdoms. So the first of these is referred to as the basic mirror-like wisdom, and these Geshe explains they're called basic wisdoms or imperfect wisdoms to distinguish them from the form that these wisdoms take when we are enlightened. But for an ordinary person, we have a basic level of these 5 wisdoms. The mirror-like wisdom is the faculty of mind that enables us to perceive many objects simultaneously. And it's called mirror-like because if you hold up a mirror, the mirror will reflect many objects simultaneously. And likewise, because of this mirror-like wisdom, we can hold a whole lot of objects, a whole lot of visual objects, a whole lot of objects of the other sense powers in our consciousness at the same time. So it's that faculty. The basic wisdom of equality is the wisdom that enables us to understand the way in which different objects are the same. So supposing I had an apple and an orange here, it's your wisdom of equality that would enable you to know that these are both similar in that they're both pieces of fruit, for example, and that they're both edible, for example. The basic wisdom of analysis is like the opposite to that. So it's the faculty of mind that enables us to perceive the differences between different objects and the names of those objects. So if I have an apple and an orange, you can tell that your basic wisdom of analysis tells you that they are different objects and that they have different names. If you have the basic wisdom of achieving activities is the faculty of mind that enables us to understand the relationship of cause and effect. It's your basic wisdom of achieving activities that enables you to know that if you take this apple, put the seeds out of it, and put the seeds in the ground, that it might produce an apple tree, for example. The basic wisdom of the nature of phenomena is the wisdom that perceives the nature of phenomena. And Geshe doesn't really explain, we'd have to do some more reading to understand what that's about, and I won't go into it at the moment. The next thing Geshe explains is the wind element, and he also makes the point that this is also sometimes known as the air element. Firstly, he explains there's a difference between gross or external winds, which is like the external wind or the external air that we experience and that we breathe, or internal winds or airs, which can also be thought of as a type of energy. And it's these internal winds, internal airs, internal energies that support our various bodily functions. And Geshe explains that you can present them in terms of 2 things. First, there are 5 root winds and 5 branch winds. The 5 branch winds are easy to understand. So that's one wind associated with each of the sense powers. So an energy associated with the eye sense power, energy associated with the ear sense power. So there are 5 of those. The 5 root winds, Geshe explains, I won't go into a great deal of detail, but he explains that each of them abides, its basis is one of the chakras, and each has a different function. So the life-bearing wind, for example, supports the life within our body for the duration of this life. The upward moving wind supports tasting, eating, drinking, and so forth. The pervasive wind is what is the energy that enables our body to move and so forth. So we can read about those. I won't go into a great deal of detail because they don't come up a lot in the subsequent explanation of the actual stages of death. So Geshe then talks about the actual stages of death in terms of the dissolution of these 25 gross objects, and this commentary starts at page 447. So at each of these 5 stages, we have some of these 25 objects are progressively dissolving, or their power is failing. They're ceasing to exert their power over us. So what happens first? So the very first stage of the death process, there are 5 of these 25 objects that dissolve, or their power ceases at the same time. So firstly, our aggregate of form begins to dissolve. It doesn't completely dissolve at this point. Secondly, our mirror-like wisdom begins to break down. Our earth element begins to break down. Our eye sense organ and object of sight. The signs of this, the way that this manifests in terms of our body, is that our body weakens and begins to wither. We can no longer see objects of sight clearly. Our body starts, because the earth element is dissolving, our body feels heavy and as if it's sinking into the ground. And often, if you speak to people who work with dying people, for example, in palliative care, they often say that you have this experience of when a person is dying that they're grabbing as if they're trying to stop themselves from sinking. The eyes stop blinking and they can't be moved, and the radiance of the body diminishes. There's also an internal sign or an internal experience that we have at that time. It's the so-called mirage-like vision. And the way this is sometimes described is we know on a hot day and we see the road in front of us and the air is sort of shimmering in front of us. Some people say the mirage-like vision is an experience that is a bit like that. The second stage, the next set of objects dissolve. So these are the aggregate of feeling, the wisdom of equality, water element, the ear sense organ, and objects of hearing. And the external signs of this is that because the aggregate of feeling is dissolved, we no longer have the experience of pleasure, displeasure, or indifference associated with any of the objects of the senses. The liquids of our body begin to dry up because the water element is failing. We can't hear sounds. And the internal sign is that we have, what we experience is what's called the smoke-like vision. And again, you read various descriptions of this. One description that I've read is that it's like an impression of a haze of smoke that's swirling in front of us. The third stage of the dissolution, the next 5 elements that dissolve are the aggregate of discrimination, wisdom of analysis, fire element, nose sense organ, and objects of smell. At this point, because our wisdom of discrimination has failed, we can no longer distinguish objects clearly. We can't tell the difference between friends, close relatives, and others. We can't remember the names of objects. Our body begins to lose its heat. We can't digest anymore. Our exhalation becomes very strong. Our inhalation is weak. It's difficult to breathe and we can no longer smell. The internal sign that we have is called the fireflies-like vision. And what this is sometimes described as if there's an image of specks of light against a dark background. So it's a bit like an impression of fireflies in the night. The fourth stage, the objects that dissolve are the aggregate of compositional factors, wisdom of achieving activities, the element, the tongue sense organ, and objects of taste and touch. So the body element, which began to dissolve at the first stage, is now completely dissolved, and the accompanying sign of that is that all physical abilities fail. Because our wisdom of achieving activities is gone, we no longer have any inspiration or motivation to act. The winds of our body contract, both gross and subtle, to our heart chakra. All sense of taste is lost, and we also lose any sense of tangible, of rough and smooth, heat and cold, and so forth. The internal vision that we have, again, it's called the butter lamp vision, and it's like an impression of a small flame that's losing strength, that's sort of sputtering out. At this stage, and particularly in Western medicine, we would be pronounced dead because our breathing has stopped. But actually, because our consciousness has not yet departed from our body, we haven't actually died at this point, and there's still some remaining heat at the heart. The remaining consciousness then dissolves in the fifth stage of the process, and this fifth stage involves the gradual dissolution of what's referred to as the 80 indicative conceptions. Geshe doesn't explain those, but you can read up about those. And then the minds of radiant white appearance, red increase, black near attainment, and the clear light of death. And these various points are experienced as in the form of a number of different visions as the energies within our subtle body move. So the first of these is the mind of radiant white appearance. So what this relates to is when we are conceived, so we're conceived from the sperm and ovum of our parents, the pure essence of the sperm, or the white drop, is said to reside in a subtle drop at our crown chakra. The pure essence of the mother's ovum resides in a subtle drop at our navel chakra. At this point, the white drop begins to descend from our crown chakra towards the heart. And at this point, we have an experience or an appearance of complete whiteness, or it's sometimes described as an appearance of complete, extensive, empty space, with the only thing within that space being white light. It's sometimes said to be like the experience of a completely empty space that's pervaded by the light of the moon. And it's also called, this stage is called the mind of white appearance, and it's also called the empty, because it's empty at this point of all conceptual minds. All we experience is this feeling of white light. Next, we experience the mind of radiant red increase, and what that is related to is the pure red, pure essence of the ovum in the nature of heat, which has resided at our heart chakra, through our navel chakra throughout our life, begins to ascend to our heart chakra. And as this happens, we have this vision of redness or of red light. Some people describe it as an experience of empty space that's covered by the light of a sunset, for example, or a coppery coloured light, some people say. But it feels more subtle even than the mind of white appearance. And it's called as the very empty because it's even empty of the mind of white appearance. Next, we experience the mind of radiant black near attainment. So this stage occurs when the white drop ascending from the crown and the red drop ascending from the navel meet at our heart chakra and dissolve into our heart chakra together. And at that time, we have an experience of complete blackness. So like the darkest night possible. Some people say it's like an experience of complete emptiness, complete spaciousness, pervaded by black light. So there's no perception of anything other than this black light at this point. And it's even more subtle than the mind of red appearance. And it's referred to, this mind of black near attainment is also referred to as the great empty. After that, the final vision that we have is that of the clear light of death. And this is an experience of the pure radiance of mind. It is an experience of complete clarity, no perception of colour, no perception of shape, just an experience of clarity. So the analogy that's sometimes given is that it's like the clarity of an autumn dawn in the sky. When you look towards the dawn sky, it's just completely crisp and clear. That's the nearest analogy to understanding what the experience of this clear light of death is like. If we are a great yogi, then we're able to meditate on this clear light of death, and we're able to use that to meditate on emptiness. And as everybody here knows, of course, Geshe was able to do that at the end of his life. He was able to maintain equipoise on emptiness for 10 days after his breathing stopped. And it was only 10 days after his breathing stopped that his body showed any signs of change following his death. After this, so our subtle wind is still at our heart chakra, but after this point, the subtle wind that supports this mind of clear light moves a little. The pure essence of the egg ascends from the heart chakra to the upper end of our central channel and leaves through our nose. The pure essence of the sperm or the white drop descends to the lower end of the central channel and leaves through the sexual organ, and that's the actual point of death. At that point, that's when our consciousness leaves our body and this life is completely done with. At that point, the heat of our heart completely dissipates, the body collapses and begins to decay, and we have nothing to do with it anymore. We no longer have any identification or feel any relationship with this body that up until us we have felt is part of us. Geshe then explains, so he talks a bit about where the heat of the body dissolves. So if we've created more non-virtue than virtue, then firstly our heat begins to contract from the crown down towards the heart. If we have more virtue, non-virtue, then we lose heat first from the feet upwards to the heart. And in both cases, our consciousness will leave from the heart. What happens immediately after that is that our new life begins. That is, our life in the intermediate state. The causes of this intermediate state being what gives rise to it are our own karma, our own virtuous or non-virtuous karma, and in particular, our attachment to the body. The intermediate state being, Geshe explains, has some limited degree of clairvoyance. So at that point, we actually have some perception of some of our previous lives. We have sense organs we're able to perceive, but they're very subtle. They're not like the sense organs of humans. And our body is a very subtle body of energy or air. Because in the intermediate state, we have some clairvoyance, we're able to perceive very distant objects, and because our body or form is composed of energy and is very subtle, it's not obstructed by external objects in the way that our current gross body is. So merely by conceiving of a place or thinking of a place, our intermediate state body or bardo body is able to go to that place in an instant. And during our life as an intermediate state being, that subtle body isn't destructible, although it does die after a period of 7 days. That's quite similar to the dream body that arises during our sleeping state. The physical aspect of the intermediate state being reflects the next existence that we are going to be reborn into based on our karma. So that's already been determined during the death process at the last point of our conceptual mind. So if we're going to be reborn as a human being, for example, well then our bardo being, our intermediate state being, will have the shape of a human being, although it's smaller than an adult human being. The experience of being in the intermediate state is that it's said as if we feel this overwhelming impulse to find another rebirth, to find another body to be reborn in. It's as if we're completely consumed by, we've got to be reborn and we've got to find the right experience to do that. And if we can't find a rebirth state in our immediate surroundings, well then we'll travel to any place that we need to in order to find a suitable place to be rebirth. In a way, this is just an illusion. It's because in fact we're inevitably going to be reborn based on our karma, and traditionally it's said that will occur within 49 days of the intermediate state being having first arisen. Although the intermediate state being, it is said, lives for only 7 days, but at the end of each period of 7 days, a new intermediate state of being will be reborn in that same form. But even though in fact we're going to be reborn within that time, we have this experience of we've got to find this new rebirth state. So that's a good point. We're at the next heading, how to take rebirth. So that's a good point to end up today. So Nick will take you through that at the next class, which will be on October the 9th. And also he's got the good luck of taking you through the last section of the book, of this chapter, which, as I mentioned before, is really useful, what to do at the time of death. And particularly it's useful not to take it as something to start picking up at the last desperate moment when we figure that we're about to head off. Really good to be familiar with it now, so that when we do get to that point, we're prepared. And also, as I said, supplemented by Geshe-la's explanation in chapter 19 of the 5 forces, how we put these 5 forces into effect during our life. Path to enlightenment, always practical, always practical. So, we'll finish with the dedication prayers. And we'll do the final prayer of the graduated path, which we'll do today in Tibetan and English. Deni ringdu bele tsognyene kata yampa ganshin sapare lo me mare kidong drowanam tandren jawe wampo dagyuchik dema sampe tsera kuntoyam jampe yangchi tsewe jezune tenpe rimpa konsang lam ji cho nyene drupe jalnam nye jeshu rangi jishin tope lam ji ne chura tsewe ranwe take che droe chi mompa sel jene chewe tamba yon ring zin ju Tenpa rinchen chogi ma chabam chab chan yampa jupe jodene yingje chambo yera chopayi pande te de sawa je pasho se che jawe me jung chun le 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 ju jang ju lam je rin pe chang Tarunam chi la peltejin Jawe te pa rindu chong ju che Lamzan trope tun chen dro je chin Gel chen sel je me dang me mingom Sera kuntu jawe na pa ye Namda lamdan drilwa ma ju che Gang se te pe cho la cho cho chu Zo jin ru la tun pa de ye tse To de nan chi ta tu do je chin Ta shi ja zo cho kong ja chu chi. By the 2 collections, vast as space, amassed with effort for a long time, may I become a chief of conquerors, a guide for all beings whose mind's eye is blinded by ignorance. Also in all lives, while not yet come to that, may Manjushri favour me with his compassion. Finding the supreme path, complete with all stages of the teachings, may I please the conquerors by practicing well. By my precise understanding of the essential points of the path, with skillful means drawn along by strong compassion, and by dispelling the mental darkness of beings, may I uphold the conqueror's teaching for a long time. Where the supreme precious teaching has not spread, also where it has spread but become degenerate, with a mind deeply moved by great compassion, may I make clear this treasure of benefit and bliss. The stages of the path, excellently established by the marvellous deeds of the conquerors and their sons, give glory to the minds of those aspiring for liberation. May the conqueror's deeds be long preserved. May all humans and non-humans remove the obstructions and establish conditions favourable to cultivating the excellent path, and never be parted for all of their lifetimes from the purest of paths which the Buddhas have praised. When someone makes effort to practice properly the 10 points of conduct of the Supreme Vehicle, may he always be assisted by the mighty protectors, and may oceans of good fortune spread out, reaching all. Gewandi Chebokun Sonam Yeshe Zog Shin Sonam Yeshe Le Jonghui Dan Ba Koni Do Ba Shu. By this virtue may all beings complete the collections of wisdom and merit and attain the two holy bodies arisen from wisdom and merit. Jiangju Sem Jogrim Bo Che Ma Che Panam Che Ju Chi Che Pan Nyamba Me Pa Ye Gong Ne Gong Du Pel Ba Shu. May the precious superior mind of enlightenment be generated in those who have not yet generated it, and not decrease in those who have developed it, but increase continuously. Okay, thank you everybody. So next Path of Enlightenment session on Sunday, 9th of October, after the Amantaka retreat. Thank you. Thank you, Monica.